The mountains loomed tall, their peaks buried under thick layers of mist that crawled down like hungry fingers, swallowing the road in a ghostly haze. The headlights of Alex's battered Jeep cut through the fog, casting eerie shadows across the pine trees that towered over the narrow road. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that clung to you, mingling with the cold that seeped through every crack in his old car. After what felt like a lifetime of driving, Alex finally saw a crooked wooden sign on the side of the road, worn and faded. "Welcome to Pine Hollow, population 1,215. A small shiver crept up his spine. He brushed it off, focusing on the thrill he felt about his new life here. Pine Hollow was the exact opposite of his old life in the city, quiet, remote, and isolated. It was the kind of town where people still waved to strangers, and the loudest sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. For a former journalist who'd grown tired of the endless deadlines, the noise, and the suffocating crowds, it was a sanctuary, or so he hoped. As he passed through the outskirts, the modest buildings of Pine Hollow came into view. It was a small, rustic town, the kind that seemed frozen in time. Old-fashioned streetlights lined the main road, casting a dim glow over wooden storefronts and cobblestone sidewalks. There was a sense of stillness that Alex had never experienced before, like the town itself was holding its breath. He parked in front of the only diner he'd seen since he arrived. A neon sign flashed Pine Hollow Diner in a faded red hue, casting an ominous glow over the peeling paint on the door. He stepped out of the car, stretching his legs and glancing around. The town seemed deserted, save for a few figures huddled at a distance, their faces obscured by shadows. Inside, the diner was dimly lit, with cracked leather booths and an ancient jukebox in the corner that looked like it hadn't played a tune in decades. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, wiping a glass and watching him with wary eyes. Alex offered her a polite nod, but her gaze remained fixed, cold and distant. "Evenin'," she muttered as he approached the counter, her voice thick with the local accent. "You must be the new guy." "Alex," he said, forcing a smile. "I just got in today. Thought I'd grab a bite to eat before I settle in." She gave a slight nod, glancing around as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. "Ain't much open this late," she said. "Most folks don't stay out after dark." Alex raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Why's that?" She shrugged, but her gaze shifted toward the darkened windows, almost as if she were looking for something out there. "Just how it is around here," she replied. "Folks mind their business, stay close to home. Nights get strange." "Strange?" he repeated, leaning forward. His journalist instincts kicked in, the desire to uncover secrets lurking beneath the surface. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing at the clock on the wall. "Look," she said, lowering her voice. "Pine Hollow's a good town, but it's got its shadows. Some things are better left alone. You just make sure you don't go wandering too far into those woods." Her eyes narrowed, her tone darkening. The trees got a way of keeping secrets. The cryptic warning lingered in his mind as he finished his meal in silence. The few other patrons kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact as if Alex's very presence was an unwelcome disturbance. When he left the diner, the air outside was colder, the mist thicker. He wrapped his coat tighter around himself as he glanced down the empty streets. A chill ran down his spine, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The cabin he rented sat at the edge of town, just before the dense forest that loomed like a wall of shadows. The locals had called it the Pines, though it felt more like the edge of the world. His new home was rustic but cozy, with wooden walls and a stone fireplace that crackled as he lit the logs stacked beside it. The only sounds were the crackling flames and the distant haunting whispers of the wind weaving through the pines. As he unpacked, he noticed a strange bundle tucked away in a drawer. A small wooden cross, a sprig of dried rosemary, and a rough-hewn stone with a strange symbol carved into it. Alex held the items, his curiosity piqued. They looked like some kind of ward, a protection charm perhaps left behind by the previous tenant. He chuckled, placing them back in the drawer. Superstition was one thing he didn't put much stock in, but as he settled in that night, lying in bed with the covers pulled tight around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Every creak and whisper outside seemed amplified, as if something was prowling around the cabin, watching, waiting. And then he heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the woods. Alex. He sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. But the sound was gone, swallowed by the silence. Just the wind, he muttered to himself, lying back down. Just the wind. The next day, Alex decided to visit the local library. He wanted to research the town's history, see if there was any truth to the whispers he'd heard about disappearances and strange occurrences. The library was an old, decrepit building that smelled of mildew and dust, its shelves lined with forgotten books and yellowed newspapers. The librarian, a thin, elderly woman with piercing blue eyes, watched him closely as he perused the shelves. Her name was Mrs. Hawthorne, and she seemed to know every corner of the library. "What brings you here, young man?" she asked, her voice sharp and clear despite her age. "Just trying to learn more about Pine Hollow," he replied, trying to sound casual. "I heard there are some interesting legends around here." She narrowed her eyes, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "Is that so? And what sort of legends would those be?" "Well," Alex hesitated, feeling a bit foolish. "I heard something about Whispering Woods. A local legend or something?" Mrs. Hawthorne's smile faded. "The Whispering Woods," she repeated softly, her gaze growing distant. "It's no legend, Mr. Monroe. People have disappeared in those woods for as long as this town's been here. Some say it's just accidents, people getting lost. But others believe there's something in those trees, something that calls to people." "What do you mean, calls to people?" Alex asked, his curiosity fully piqued. "They say the woods have a voice," she continued, her voice barely a whisper. "A voice that whispers your name, that lures you deeper until you're lost. And once you're lost, you're never seen again." The words hung heavy in the air, and Alex felt an unsettling chill. He tried to shake it off, chalking it up to superstition, but a part of him couldn't ignore the unease settling in his stomach. "Have you ever heard it?" he asked, half joking, but his voice wavered. Mrs. Hawthorne didn't answer. She just looked at him, her blue eyes dark and unfathomable, and said, "Be careful, Mr. Monroe. Curiosity can be a dangerous thing." That night, Alex sat by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in hand, trying to make sense of what he'd learned. The story Mrs. Hawthorne told him had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. And as the fire crackled, he found himself staring out the window, his gaze drawn to the dark looming shadows of the trees. The woods seemed alive, shifting and swaying in the moonlight, and for a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. He blinked, but the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Shaking his head, he took another sip of whiskey. "Just your imagination," he told himself. "You're letting these silly stories get to you." But then, faintly, he heard it again, that same whisper from the night before. This time, it was clearer, closer. "Alex." He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He strained his ears, trying to catch the sound again, but all he heard was the rustling of leaves and the crackling of the fire. It was as if the whisper had come from within his own mind, an echo that lingered in the silence. Determined to shake off the fear, he grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. He shone the beam into the woods, the light cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just trees, swaying in the wind. But as he turned to go back inside, he heard it one last time, barely a whisper carried on the wind. "Come find me." The following morning, Alex awoke to a sky painted in shades of gray, the dense mist clinging stubbornly to the tops of the trees. The events of the previous night felt like a fever dream, Yet the feeling of unease lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave his side. Determined to shake off the eerie encounter, he decided to visit the Pine Hollow Library, a dusty relic of a building he'd spotted on the main road. The thought of burying himself in town records and local newspapers held a certain appeal. If he was going to be in Pine Hollow, he might as well try to understand its history. Inside, the library was cold and smelled of mildew and yellowed paper. Shelves towered high, filled with forgotten volumes and records, the dust on them thick enough to tell stories of neglect. Behind the front desk, the librarian, Mrs. Hawthorne, sat as if she were a fixture of the place. She had a piercing gaze that seemed to hold centuries of secrets. "Good morning," Alex greeted her, forcing a polite smile. Mrs. Hawthorne's gaze sharpened, her expression unreadable. "Mornin'," she replied curtly. Her voice was as sharp as the air outside, and Alex sensed a hint of suspicion in her tone. She continued to watch him as if assessing his intentions. "I'm Alex Monroe," he introduced himself, hoping to bridge the silent distance between them. "I moved here recently, just outside of town. Thought I'd check out the local history, maybe learn a bit about the area." "Local history, Mrs. Hawthorne echoed, her lips curling in a slight smirk. "Most folks around here don't dig too deep into Pine Hollow's past. Too many skeletons in the closet, if you catch my meaning." Alex chuckled lightly, but her comment only piqued his curiosity. "That's exactly what I'm interested in," he said, his tone turning serious. "I heard some stories about the woods, people going missing, strange occurrences. Is any of it true?" Mrs. Hawthorne's expression darkened, and for a moment Alex wondered if he had overstepped. But then slowly she leaned forward, her gaze intense. "You mean the Whispering Woods," she said, her voice a bare whisper, as if the very walls were listening. Alex nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "People around here have long believed there's something in those trees, something that don't belong. Folks who wander in there looking for answers, they don't always come back." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The woods have a way of calling to people. It starts with whispers, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. And once it has you..." She trailed off, her eyes haunted, as if recalling something best left forgotten. A shiver ran down Alex's spine. "Has anyone ever survived?" Mrs. Hawthorne gave a mirthless laugh, her gaze distant. "Some come back, changed, eyes hollow, minds shattered. Those that do return don't speak of what they saw or heard. And many, like my brother, never return at all." He froze. "Your brother?" "Matthew," she whispered, the name heavy on her tongue. "Disappeared in those woods 40 years ago. Left one night, said he heard something calling his name. The search party found nothing. No tracks, no sign of him. Only his hat, hanging from a tree branch deep in the forest, as if it were placed there by something. Or someone." Alex swallowed, unsure of what to say. He glanced at the rows of newspapers stacked neatly on a shelf, bound in leather covers. "Mind if I take a look at some of the old papers? Maybe there's something in there about these disappearances." Mrs. Hawthorne hesitated, her gaze lingering on him with a wary intensity. Then, with a slight nod, she gestured to the dusty shelves. "Help yourself. But take my advice, Mr. Monroe. Don't go looking for trouble in those woods. Not unless you're prepared for what you might find." He thanked her and made his way to the stacks, pulling out old editions of the Pine Hollow Gazette. The stories in those pages were haunting, residents vanishing without a trace, search parties finding nothing but eerie clues, scraps of clothing, half-buried possessions, a child's shoe left at the edge of a stream, and every story held one thing in common: the whispers. Survivors reported hearing their names called, as if by loved ones long gone, luring them deeper into the forest. Some claimed the voices were accompanied by visions of those they had lost, shadowy figures just out of reach. As he read, An uncomfortable realization began to form in Alex's mind. It wasn't just about the disappearances. It was the secrecy, the way the townsfolk seemed to accept it as a grim fact of life. A part of him wanted to dismiss it all as superstition, an exaggerated folklore that had taken root in the town's psyche. But the other part of him, the part that had experienced those whispers himself, couldn't shake the gnawing sense that something was deeply wrong in Pine Hollow. When he finally looked up, hours had passed. The library was almost empty, and Mrs. Hawthorne had disappeared into the back room. Gathering his things, he made his way to the door, feeling the weight of the town's history settle on his shoulders. As he stepped outside, the air felt colder, heavier. The sun had begun to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the street. And in the distance, he could see the woods dark and foreboding as if watching him in return. Back at his cabin, Alex tried to shake off the unease that had settled in his bones. He lit a fire in the stone fireplace and poured himself a drink, hoping the warmth would dispel the chill that clung to him. But as night fell, the silence grew thicker, more oppressive. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the distant rustle of leaves outside. He tried to distract himself, flipping through the notes he'd taken at the library, but his mind kept drifting back to the whispers Mrs. Hawthorne had mentioned. Voices calling people by name, luring them into the woods. He glanced at the window, his gaze drawn to the dark silhouette of the trees beyond. A strange sensation filled him, like a pull deep in his chest, urging him to step outside to wander just a little further into the night. And then, he heard it again. "Alex?" The whisper was faint, almost like a breath against the window pane. His heart pounded as he stared into the darkness, straining to see if there was anything, or anyone, out there. But there was nothing, just the shadows dancing in the faint glow of the moon. Swallowing hard, he turned away from the window, his mind racing. "It's just the wind," he told himself, but the words felt hollow. He'd heard his name, as clear as day, as if someone had been standing right beside him. Then, a soft creak echoed through the cabin. He spun around, his pulse quickening. The room was empty, yet the air felt charged, thick with an unseen presence. Steeling himself, he grabbed a flashlight and made his way to the front door, determined to prove that it was nothing more than his imagination. As he stepped outside, the cold night air bit into his skin, and the silence of the forest pressed in around him. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the tall pines that surrounded the cabin. He swept the light across the clearing, his breath visible in the cold air. But there was nothing, only the trees and the shadows they cast. He took a step forward, his gaze locked on the forest, and that's when he saw it, a faint shadowy figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was barely visible, more a silhouette than a person, but he could feel its gaze on him, cold and unyielding. "Hello?" he called out, his voice wavering. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It simply stood there, watching. A chill ran down his spine, and he fought the urge to turn and run. Instead, he took a cautious step closer, squinting into the darkness. But as he moved, the figure seemed to dissolve, melting into the shadows until it was gone. He stood there, alone in the silence, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, just as he was about to turn back to the cabin, he heard it again. That same whisper, soft and insistent. "Come find me." The words hung in the air, filling him with a sense of dread. He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the trees, and made his way back inside, bolting the door behind him. Sleep did not come easily that night. Alex lay in bed, the eerie encounter replaying over and over in his mind, the shadowy figure and the whispered words weaving a relentless tension that gripped his chest. Every creak of the cabin, every soft gust of wind against the windows sent his mind spiraling, half convinced it was something, or someone, lurking outside. By morning, his nerves were frayed, and a sleepless fog clouded his thoughts. Yet, A new resolve had taken hold of him. Whatever was going on in Pine Hollow, he would find the truth and make sense of the horrors that were unfolding around him. The first person that came to mind was old Tom at the Pine Hollow General Store. He seemed to know more about the woods than he had let on, and perhaps he could offer some insight into the shadow Alex had seen. So, as soon as he could gather himself, he made his way to town, feeling the weight of unseen eyes as he passed through the now familiar pine trees. Tom greeted him with a wary look, as if he'd expected Alex to return. "Back already, eh?" he said, eyeing Alex from behind the counter. "Looking a bit worse for wear, if you don't mind me saying." "Something strange happened last night," Alex replied, cutting straight to the point. He described the shadowy figure, the whispers, and the growing sense of something malevolent hiding just beyond his reach. Tom listened silently, his weathered face impassive but his eyes betraying a flicker of concern. "You say you heard your name?" he asked, his voice low. Alex nodded. "Clear as day, and I saw someone, or something, watching me from the trees." Tom glanced around the store, then leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. "You've heard about the whispers, I reckon. But the folks around here don't talk about what they really are, 'cause they're too afraid. Some of us believe those voices. They're the lost ones." "The lost ones?" Alex asked, feeling a chill run down his spine. "People who've gone missing over the years," Tom said, his gaze distant. "Some say their spirits get trapped in the woods, that they're drawn there by something dark. And once they're in, they become a part of it. Shadows, whispers, faint traces of who they used to be." Alex felt his skepticism slipping, eroded by the fear he'd felt in the presence of that shadow. "Are you saying the people who disappear become the whispers?" Tom shrugged, his expression grim. "It's just a legend, maybe nothing more. But when you live in a place like this long enough, you start to believe in things you never would have thought possible." Before Alex could respond, the store door creaked open, and a young woman entered. She was about his age, with wary eyes and an aura of weariness that seemed to mirror his own. She looked between them, her gaze lingering on Alex. "You're the new guy, right?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. Alex nodded, slightly taken aback. "Yeah, I'm Alex. And you are?" "Lily," she replied, her expression guarded. "I heard you're asking questions about the woods." Alex glanced at Tom, who gave a small nod. "I've had a few strange experiences," he admitted, "and I'm trying to figure out what's really going on here." Lily's eyes darkened and she moved closer, her voice barely audible. "The people here won't tell you the whole story. They're too scared of what might happen if they do. But I've been in those woods, and I've seen things you wouldn't believe." The three of them sat in the back of the store, Tom watching them with a cautious gaze. Lily recounted her story in hushed tones as if the walls themselves might be listening. "3 years ago," she began, "my little brother Ben disappeared in those woods. The search parties found nothing, no sign of him, just gone. My family was devastated, but I couldn't accept it. I couldn't just move on. So one night I went into the woods, hoping to find him. I knew it was foolish, but I had to try." Her voice faltered, and she took a shaky breath before continuing. "At first it was quiet, too quiet. Then I heard him, Ben, calling my name as clear as day. I followed the voice deeper and deeper, until the trees started to close in, like they were alive. And that's when I saw it." "Saw what?" Alex asked, leaning in, his heart pounding. "A figure," she whispered. "Tall and shadowy, like something pulled from a nightmare. It had hollow eyes, and its face, it looked like Ben, but twisted, wrong. I ran, but the whispers followed me, calling my name, telling me to come back. I barely made it out." The color had drained from Alex's face. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Lily laughed bitterly. "I tried, but people here don't want to hear the truth. They're afraid of what's out there, but they'd rather ignore it than face it. After Ben changed, I knew I couldn't stay quiet. Someone has to know what's really going on. Alex glanced at Tom, who nodded solemnly. Lily's not the first to see such things, and she won't be the last. A silence settled over them, thick with shared understanding. For the first time, Alex realized he wasn't alone in this. There were others who had seen the shadows, heard the whispers, and felt the call of something darker than they could explain. As he left the store, Lily handed him a slip of paper. "If you need help, if you decide to go back in, call me. You shouldn't go alone." That night, Alex's mind churned with the weight of Lily's story, and an insatiable curiosity began to build within him, pushing against his own fears. He felt a pull, a need to understand the truth about the woods, as if the answers lay just beyond his reach. He spent the next day preparing himself. He gathered supplies, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a notebook to document anything he encountered. The thought of going into the woods alone terrified him, but he knew he had to confront whatever was hiding in Pine Hollow. He couldn't keep running. Just as dusk settled, casting the world in shades of gray and shadows, Alex dialed Lily's number. She answered on the first ring. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with apprehension. "I am," he replied, gripping the phone tightly. "Meet me at the trailhead in an hour." The forest loomed before them as they stood at the edge, flashlights in hand, the weight of the darkness pressing down on them. Lily looked at him, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex nodded, though his heart raced. "I need to know. I can't keep living in fear of what I don't understand." They stepped into the woods together, the silence swallowing them whole. The trees seemed to close in around them, their twisted branches casting skeletal shadows on the ground. The air grew colder, and the familiar sense of being watched settled over them like a shroud. And then, as they ventured deeper, the whispers began. Soft at first, like a gentle breeze brushing past their ears. But gradually they grew louder, more insistent, filling the air with voices both familiar and foreign. "Alex. Lily." They froze, their flashlights trembling as they scanned the darkness. Alex's breath came in short, shallow gasps, and he could see the fear mirrored in Lily's eyes. "It's them," she whispered, clutching his arm. "The lost ones. They're calling us." But Alex couldn't turn back now. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind, drawing him forward like a siren song. And just as he thought he would be swallowed whole by the shadows, he saw it. A figure standing just beyond the trees, watching him with hollow eyes. The shadowy figure's face shifted, contorted, taking on different forms, flickering between the faces of strangers and loved ones, some alive, others long dead. And then it spoke, its voice a chilling echo that reverberated through his very soul. "Come find me." The words were a command, an invitation and a warning all at once, and as Alex stared into those hollow eyes, he felt the terrible truth of Pine Hollow settle upon him. The woods were alive, haunted by the spirits of those who had been lost, drawn into the darkness by a force older and darker than he could comprehend. And now, it wanted him too. The shadowy figure melted into the darkness as Alex and Lily stumbled back, adrenaline pounding through their veins. The forest around them seemed to hum, a low vibration that thrummed in the roots and branches. The whispers faded for a moment, then returned stronger, louder, calling them forward, drawing them in like a web tightening around prey. "Did you see that?" Alex breathed, his voice barely audible. He couldn't tear his eyes from the space where the figure had stood, its hollow eyes seared into his memory. Lily nodded, her face pale but resolute. "I've seen it before. It's almost like they're trapped, trying to reach out to us." "Trapped?" Alex repeated, struggling to make sense of it. "After my brother disappeared, I came here night after night, hoping to find something, anything, and every time I'd see those shadows, faces that flickered and shifted, like they were people I used to know. Some days I even thought I heard Ben. The pain in her voice was raw, and Alex felt a pang of empathy. He'd come to Pine Hollow hoping to escape the chaos of his own life, but the town seemed to carry more weight, more grief, than he could have imagined. A shiver ran down his spine as the air grew colder, thick with something unexplainable. It was as though the forest itself was breathing, pulsing with life. "We need to keep going," he said, his voice low but steady. "I need to know what's causing this. Whatever's in here, it isn't just superstition." Lily hesitated but nodded. They pushed deeper into the woods, moving in silence, their flashlights piercing the darkness. The trees loomed taller, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Every so often, Alex could swear he saw a shadow darting between the trees, but whenever he looked directly, it vanished, leaving only the faint rustling of leaves. They came upon a clearing shrouded in mist with a small, dilapidated cabin in the center. It looked ancient, its wooden beams warped and rotting, as if it had been abandoned for decades. Vines had overtaken the structure, crawling up its walls and snaking through broken windows. Alex felt a strange pull toward it, a sense of familiarity he couldn't place. "This must be it," he whispered. Lily frowned. "I've never seen this place before, but I feel like I have. It's like a dream I can't quite remember." The two approached cautiously, each step heavy, as though the ground itself was trying to hold them back. The cabin seemed to exude an aura of despair, a palpable sadness that settled over them like a heavy fog. Alex reached for the door, which hung crookedly on rusted hinges, and pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was barren. Dust-coated surfaces and cobwebs covered the corners, and a faint smell of decay hung in the air. In the center of the room was a worn wooden table, carved with symbols and strange markings. Alex ran his fingers over the carvings, feeling the grooves beneath his skin. "What do you think these mean?" he asked, turning to Lily, who was examining a tattered piece of cloth on the floor. She shook her head, her eyes dark with worry. "I don't know, but I've seen these symbols before, on trees, etched into rocks near the woods. They're old, really old. I think they're part of what's been here since before this town even existed." A chill settled over Alex as he looked around, noticing the symbols scratched into nearly every surface. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling bore the same strange markings. They seemed to pulse in the dim light, as if holding secrets within their lines and curves. Suddenly, a faint guttural sound filled the cabin, breaking the silence. It was a voice muffled and distant, yet unmistakably human. "Help. Me." Alex's blood ran cold as he and Lily exchanged horrified glances. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his heart pounding. "Yes," Lily replied, her face ashen. She clutched his arm, her gaze fixed on the doorway to a smaller room in the back of the cabin. Taking a deep breath, Alex led the way, his flashlight trembling as he moved toward the sound. The room was empty, save for a mirror leaning against the wall, its glass cracked and covered in a layer of grime. He approached it cautiously, wiping the dust away with his sleeve. His reflection stared back at him, pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with fear. But then, something shifted. In the mirror's surface, the room around him seemed to change. The walls grew darker, the air thick with shadows, and behind him, he saw a figure materialize. A shadow with hollow eyes, watching him with an intensity that sent a spike of terror through his core. He spun around, but the room was empty. "Alex, what's wrong?" Lily asked, sensing his fear. "There was someone behind me in the mirror," he stammered, struggling to catch his breath. Lily glanced at the mirror, her face tense. "I don't see anything, but whatever we're dealing with here, it's messing with our minds." Just then, the whispers began again, louder and more insistent. They filled the cabin, their words overlapping in a haunting cacophony, each voice pleading, begging, warning. "Don't stay. Leave. Turn back." But there was one voice that cut through the rest, cold and commanding, its words echoing in his mind. Find the gate. The gate? Alex murmured, frowning. The words seemed familiar, but he couldn't place them. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a sense that he was close to understanding, to unraveling the mystery that had haunted Pine Hollow for generations. Lily looked at him, her face twisted with fear. What gate? I don't know, he replied, frustration lacing his voice. But whatever it is, I think it's tied to these disappearances. Maybe it's where they're being taken. Lily's eyes widened as realization dawned on her. Do you think it could be some kind of passage between our world and whatever's out there? The words hung heavy in the air, as if the forest itself was listening. But before Alex could respond, a sudden violent gust of wind burst through the cabin, extinguishing their flashlights and plunging them into darkness. Alex's breath hitched as he felt the presence closing in around them, the shadows seeming to take shape, to come alive. He reached out, grabbing Lily's hand, and together they stumbled toward the door, their only chance of escape. They burst out into the clearing, gasping for breath, their hearts racing. The forest was alive with movement, shadows dancing among the trees, and the whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices echoing through the night. And then, in the distance, Alex saw it, a faint glow, pulsing with an otherworldly light, hidden among the trees. The glow was faint, but unmistakable, drawing him forward like a moth to a flame. There, he said, pointing toward the light. That must be the gate. Lily looked at him, her face a mixture of fear and determination. Are you sure we should go toward it? I don't know, he replied, swallowing hard. But we've come this far. Whatever's going on here, I need to know the truth. They moved toward the glow, each step filled with trepidation. As they drew closer, the whispers grew deafening, a symphony of voices crying out in despair, their words tangled and incoherent. The light grew brighter, illuminating a small clearing where an ancient stone archway stood, covered in the same strange symbols they'd seen in the cabin. The archway seemed to hum with energy, the air around it shimmering as though it were a doorway to somewhere else, a place beyond human comprehension. The ground beneath it was littered with remnants of those who had come before, tattered clothing, scattered belongings, fragments of lives lost to the shadows. Alex reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the cold stone of the archway. The moment his fingers made contact, a surge of energy pulsed through him, filling him with visions, flashes of faces, people he'd never known but somehow recognized, each of them drawn to the gate, compelled by a force they couldn't resist. And then, he saw himself, standing at the edge of the archway, his eyes hollow, his face twisted in terror. He was one of them, a shadow lost to the darkness. He pulled his hand back, gasping for breath, and looked at Lily. This is where they go, where they're taken. It's a trap. Lily's face was pale, her expression one of horror. If that's true, then everyone who's ever gone missing, they're still here, in the woods, part of the whispers. The realization hit them both like a punch to the gut. The gate wasn't just a passage, it was a prison, a place where lost souls were trapped, bound to the forest for eternity. They backed Alex and Lily backed away from the glowing archway, their breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps. The forest seemed to press in around them, watching, waiting. The gate stood silent, pulsing with a cold, hypnotic light that felt alive, hungry. Alex, we need to leave, Lily whispered, clutching his arm. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. If this thing is what's keeping them here, then we shouldn't be anywhere near it. But Alex didn't move. He felt rooted to the spot, his eyes fixed on the archway. There was something in its light that called to him, that seemed to reach inside and stir a part of him he'd long buried. A voice echoed in his mind, soft and soothing, promising answers. Peace. An end to the mystery. Do you feel that? He murmured, his voice distant, dreamlike. Lily shook him, her fingers digging into his arm. Alex, snap out of it. That's exactly what it wants. Don't let it in. Don't let it get to you. Her words pulled him back, and he blinked, shaking off the daze. The light around the gate dimmed, its call growing faint, as if retreating. "You're right," he said, struggling to steady his breathing. "It's trying to pull us in. It's almost like it's alive." A branch snapped somewhere behind them, and they whirled around, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. In the shadows, a figure moved, slow and deliberate, stepping into the faint light of the clearing. It was a man, his face partially obscured by a hood, his features gaunt and hollow. He looked as though he had been there for centuries, his skin weathered and pale, his eyes sunken and shadowed. Yet his expression held a grim authority, as if he alone controlled the forest's secrets. "Who are you?" Alex asked, his voice wavering. The presence of this stranger felt as unnatural as the gate itself. The man smiled faintly, his gaze shifting between Alex and Lily. "You have seen the gate," he said, his voice low and rasping, as if it hadn't been used in years. "Few come this close. Fewer still leave." Lily took a step back, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean by that? Who are you, and what do you want?" The man chuckled softly, the sound hollow and unsettling. "I am the keeper," he said, inclining his head. "I tend to the gate, and to the souls who have passed through it, and I ensure that the balance is maintained." "The balance?" Alex echoed, his mind racing. "What balance?" The keeper's gaze settled on him, piercing and ancient. "The gate serves as a passage between worlds. It holds the souls of those who are drawn to the forest. But every so often a new soul must enter, to feed the shadows, to keep the others bound." Alex felt his stomach churn, a cold dread settling over him. "So, all the people who disappeared, they were sacrifices?" The keeper nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Sacrifices, perhaps. Or willing wanderers, depending on how you view it. Some sought answers, others were called by the forest. Each was taken, and each remains, part of the whispers, part of the darkness." Lily's face twisted with horror and fury. "You're telling me my brother, my Ben, he's in there, trapped as part of this?" The keeper's face softened, almost sympathetically. "Your brother is bound like the others, lost in time, caught between worlds, but he is at peace, in a sense. He is one with the forest." "No," Lily said, her voice cracking. "No, he's not at peace. I heard him. He's suffering, all of them are. You can't stand there and tell us this is balance." The keeper raised a hand, his voice hardening. "Do not presume to understand forces beyond you, child. The forest takes what it needs. And it seems, tonight it may have found what it needs in you two." A heavy silence fell over them, punctuated only by the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of whispers. "What do you mean?" Alex asked, his voice barely audible. The keeper's gaze was cold, unwavering. "Once you have seen the gate, felt its pull, you belong to it. It has claimed you. And now, you must choose. You may leave this place, return to your lives, but the gate will not forget you. It will call to you year after year, night after night, until you answer." He paused, the shadows seeming to deepen around him. "Or, you may pass through the gate willingly, end the suffering of those bound within, and join them. This forest will be your home, and you will serve the balance just as I do." Lily's voice shook with anger. "You want us to give ourselves to this, just like that? That's insane." The keeper tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "It is a choice few are given, and it is not without its rewards. The gate offers power, understanding. Those who serve it gain knowledge, insights into realms beyond mortal understanding." Alex's mind reeled, the keeper's words filling him with a sick fascination. Part of him wanted to turn and run, to escape the weight of the darkness surrounding them. But another part, the same part that had brought him to Pine Hollow in the first place, was drawn to the mystery, the forbidden knowledge the keeper spoke of. Lily grabbed his arm, her voice trembling. "Alex, please, don't listen to him. "This is wrong. We have to get out of here before it's too late." But the keeper's gaze held him, unwavering, as if seeing through to his very soul. "You came seeking truth, Alex, and the truth is here, in the heart of the forest. All the answers you've ever sought, all the mysteries that elude you, they lie beyond the gate. All you must do is cross." Alex felt himself sway, the gate's pulsing light drawing him in, its whispers filling his mind with promises and secrets. He saw visions of faces, fragments of lives, pieces of stories that had been lost to time. The gate was calling him, offering him a place among the shadows, a chance to know the unknown. Lily's grip tightened, and she turned him toward her, her eyes pleading. "Alex, don't. This is what it does. It gets inside your head, makes you think you want this. But it's all lies. You don't belong here. We don't belong here." The clarity in her voice cut through the fog, and Alex felt a surge of resolve. She was right. The forest, the whispers, the gate. It was all a trap, a prison for lost souls. He didn't want to become one of them. He didn't want to lose himself to the darkness. He took a step back, pulling Lily with him. The keeper's eyes narrowed, his face twisted with anger. "You're making a grave mistake," he said, his voice cold and venomous. "The gate does not release those who have seen it. It will find you no matter where you go. You will never be free of its call." Alex met the keeper's gaze, his own eyes burning with defiance. Maybe. But I'd rather live with that than become a part of this nightmare. Without another word, he turned and ran, pulling Lily along as they stumbled back through the trees, the shadows closing in around them. The whispers grew louder, filling the forest with their haunting cries, but Alex ignored them, focusing only on the path ahead, the faint glimmer of moonlight guiding their way. The forest seemed to fight them, branches reaching out like claws, the ground shifting beneath their feet, but they pushed forward, their determination unbreakable. The gate's light faded behind them, the whispers growing fainter, until at last they burst free of the trees, gasping for breath, the town lights flickering in the distance. They stood there, staring back at the dark line of trees, the weight of the night settling over them. The forest was silent now, the whispers gone. But Alex knew the keeper's warning would haunt him for the rest of his life. The gate had let them go, but it wouldn't forget.